Buenos días. Buenos Morgan. Hi, how are you? Thanks for the invitation to speak to you, with you this morning. I thought that we made a wonderful transition from what's going on outside of the United States into the United States, and I want to still sort of go into that area with US Latino stuff, and then make references to Latin America as we do that, and then we'll open it up again for the rest of the world by going to China and Africa and so on. I wanted to give you then sort of a Latino take on the future of US missions. And of course, I am no prophet, but there are some trends to look at and reflect on a little bit. So I want to first share with you that in 2007, the Pew Research Center, and anybody heard of Pew, P-E-W? Yeah. It's a very important tool to be able to get a sense of the demographics and trends and so on, P-U-W. Anyways, in 2007, Pew Research Center surveys, 15% of US adults answer a question about their current religion by saying they were atheist, agnostic, or, quote, nothing in particular. The number of Americans who do not identify with any religion, also known as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, continues to grow at a rapid pace. 1/5 of the US public and 1/3 of adults under 30, we are told, are religiously unaffiliated today. Now, that's the highest percentage ever in Pew Research Center findings. So that's significant. We're talking about 20% of US adults, 20% of US adults. What you see in the graph is simply showing you kind of the growth in 5 years, going from 2007 to 2012. There's been some significant growth in the number of nuns. Again, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. That's another kind of nun, yeah. You always have to say this because people think, what's going on here? Now, we're talking about 20% of US adults, 20% of US adults religiously unaffiliated. The ranks now include more than 13 million self-described atheists and agnostics. So that's about 6% of all US adults. But the nuns also include 33 million people who say they have no particular religious affiliation. That's about 15% of the US adult population. So the nuns include both sort of secularized nuns. They tend to go more in the way of agnosticism, atheism, that kind of a thing. And then you have this other group, which is religiously unaffiliated, but may actually not be as secularized. So it is kind of a complex picture to begin with, okay? Now, this research suggests we are at least partly on our way to becoming a non-nation, and we'll have to be ready as a church to deal with this particular challenge and opportunity. Now, I find that there's an affinity between the research on the nuns and the work of my colleague, Bob Newton. Now, Bob Newton, will you please stand? I don't know that everybody knows you here, but here is Bob Newton, and here's a high school picture of his. All right, so now in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, Bob Newton, who's a missiologist, he also happens to be a district president of the Northern California, Hawaii district of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Now, he has been reminding the Lutheran Church for a while now that we are in a post-Christian era. We live in an unchurched society and in a pluralistic religious landscape. And so we can no longer think of the church as the privileged sphere of religious values or assume that people will be directed to the church for the answer to their spiritual questions. As Newton has put it in the recent past, we are no longer living in Jerusalem, by which he means church society, but rather in Babylon, or unchurched society. Now, Newton's analysis, I think, fits well with the research on the nuns that we have just been talking about. He has sort of contextualized that for a Lutheran U.S. audience, which is primarily Anglo. Lutheran Church is over 90% Anglo. And it describes, I think, a lot of what's happening to the youth, primarily Anglo youth in the United States and so on. So I think his research fits especially well with this Pew data. It fits well, especially in a North Atlantic context, where arguably a broader societal move towards atheism, agnosticism, and secularism has to some degree predominated. That's about 13 million, right, of the nuns in the United States. In such milieu, the lost neighbor the church reaches out to is primarily the non-believer or the unbeliever of the secularized first world. Newton's analysis also has an affinity with the research on the other 33 million nuns, namely the religiously unaffiliated or unchurched. Now, these unchurched people, as I said before, and Jenkins mentioned this yesterday, they may actually see themselves as spiritual in some sense. So levels of secularism differ with this particular group. They may or not be hostile to the church, but they are highly suspicious of the institutional church. So you have kind of a mixed bag there. Now, I find Bob Newton's reflection, coupled with the research done by Pew, to be quite appealing, persuasive, and it's an important analysis to keep in your toolbox as you do missions in the United States, as you move towards the future. But I also ask myself, of course, especially in light of yesterday's presentations, if this model is maybe sufficient to understand what the mission of the church in the future U.S. would look like. And I think that now we can see that there's also another story at work at the same time. And that's the Global South story. And the way I enter the Global South conversation is usually through the Hispanic Latino contingent, the Latin American contingent in the United States. So that's another story in the making to keep in mind as we think about missions in the future and even now here in the United States. This is the story of, in part, Latin American immigration to the United States. That's a big slice of the Global South right here in our backyard. I don't have to tell you who live in California that. As Jenkins put it yesterday, the South is in the North in the form of people. According to the Pew Research Center, since 2000, the immigrant population in the U.S. has increased by 30%. As one would expect, Mexico is the largest source of U.S. immigrants at about 12 million. But know also that the unauthorized immigration flow has slowed down in recent years. The reasons for this are not our main concern here, but what is interesting is that we now know the majority of the population growth among non-Anglo ethnic immigrant groups is now due to birth rate, not immigration. These U.S.-born children of immigrant groups will be a force to be reckoned with in church and society. They will be disproportionately the largest labor force in the United States, for example. What does that mean? How will they be included? How will they shape our ecclesial institutions? How might they re-energize the church? Consider also that according to U.S. Census Bureau's estimation for 2012, we already know that 50+% of American children under the age of 1 belong to minority groups, soon to be, right, majorities, actually already majority group. So we are already on our way to becoming a multicultural, cross-cultural, intercultural nation as a whole. I say as a whole because, you know, there are some places where the statistics are blown out of proportion. All right, like when somebody tells me that they're serving a congregation in California in a town that's 90% Hispanic, none of this applies in a sense. California is a worse state. No statistics apply to you guys, and everything applies to you guys. It's just that kind of thing. California is already there. California is already there, meaning, you know, it's already an intercultural, multicultural society, leading the way. 6 in 10 U.S. immigrants live in the states we may think of as the usual suspects. But here, California actually has 25% of the share of immigrants in the United States. Notice that Texas is there too, New York, and so on. Unless we revitalize our institutions with contributions from Global South immigrants and their children, our desire to engage the Global South in the North will remain wishful thinking. You have to see how you bring into the pipelines of the church this growing group. And that's going to take some effort. And I'm going to have some suggestions on how to maybe start the conversation on that. Anyway, so that's the reality of immigration to the United States. And we heard a lot about that other way of kind of looking at the world. So you have all this research on the nuns and the move towards secularism, right, agnosticism, on church, people groups. And then you have this other massive research on Global South stuff. And that's a different group of people, though there are characteristics of both that intersect at times. Now, our main speaker, Philip Jenkins, has argued that far from being an export of the capitalist West, a vestige of Euro-American imperialism, Christianity is now rooted in the third world. It even has a history there. And the religion's future lies in the Global South. Now, to appreciate the potential impact of the Global South in the future of the church in the United States, we need to weed out some doom and gloom scenarios. And Philip Jenkins is quite good at this, and I think he touched on that yesterday. One scenario would be the rise of Islam. Jenkins argues that at least when it comes to U.S. religious context, Muslim demographics tend to be blown out of proportion. And moreover, any likely Muslim growth through immigration will be far exceeded by the continuing Christian influx from Africa, Asia, and above all, Latin America. So that doesn't mean you don't deal with Islam, right? And in some communities, that might actually be your main focus. But just in terms of the larger picture, and the reason why Jenkins brings this up is that he feels, for example, that the Global South doesn't get enough attention in discourses on missiology, in the academy, religious studies programs. So Islam overwhelmingly takes a lot of attention. He says, well, we're missing the Global South. Who's going to be dealing with that? Who's going to be teaching that? Something to keep in mind. The other fairly common assumption made about the U.S. religious landscape has been that unless we do something right now to stop what is coming, we're almost inevitably on our way to becoming a godless country or a post-Christian country if we're not already there. So I think that's part of the picture, as I mentioned before, but that is not the whole picture. It's not the whole picture. The challenge, and this is often what you hear from certain pulpits all the time. Every time somebody talks about doing theology in the United States, They always talk about how we're, inevitably in some kind of increasingly secularized, materialistic, relativistic world. Sometimes the word postmodern is thrown in there, and everything is hostile to the gospel. And that becomes sort of the typical way that you get the culture analyzed nowadays, often from certain sectors of Christianity in the United States. And again, that's part of the picture, but not the whole picture, so stop doing that. That is not the only way to look at what's happening. That's part of the picture. And I say this because Global South people do not exactly fit the data on the nuns. Consider this. Decline in mainline Protestant churches, and that would include the Lutherans, does not necessarily mean that the U.S. religious landscape is inevitably becoming post-Christian or hopelessly secular. In fact, we can expect and are already seeing significant growth in Roman Catholic, Evangelical, and Pentecostal charismatic churches in the United States. We see this happening especially among immigrants and their children. Let's take the example of people of Latin American origin coming to and living in the United States and their children. More than 2/3 of Hispanics identify themselves as Roman Catholics. The next largest category, at 15%, is made up of born-again or evangelical Christians. Their worldview is obviously not secular. It is a religious, spiritual worldview. For the great majority of Latinos, regardless of their religious tradition, God is an active force in everyday life. Most Latinos, we are told, pray every day. Most have a religious object in their home, and most attend a religious service at least once a month. By significant majorities, Latinos who identify with a religion believe that miracles are performed today just as they were in ancient times. And their discourse tends to be more pneumatically oriented, pneumatic from spirit, more spirit, Holy Spirit oriented, spiritual warfare, that kind of thing. Something that Jenkins described is true of the Global South in general. That is not a country that's becoming godless. That is not a country that's becoming increasingly secularized, agnostics, atheists, fill in the blank. So you cannot exegete the U.S. religious landscape only with the one story. You're talking about at least two different stories. Moreover, the growth of the Hispanic population is leading to the emergence of Latino-oriented churches around the country. 2/3 of Latino worshipers attend churches with Latino clergy, services in Spanish, and heavily Latino congregations. While most predominant among the foreign-born and Spanish speakers, Hispanic-oriented worship, regardless of whether you use English, Spanish, or Spanglish, is not simply a product of immigration or language. It has to do a lot with ethnic identification, belonging in a people's group. So to say, once you get to second, third generation Hispanics, now they're totally in a different park. They've totally changed from their Hispanic roots. They totally not relate to that. That is not entirely true. That may happen in some cases, but often that's not the case. So again, there are no simplistic answers, all right, when it comes to the future of the mission in the United States. You have a lot of complexity within people's groups, though we like to place people in categories. One of the most diverse groups that I teach at the seminary are the students from the Center for Hispanic Studies. They represent all kinds of different Latin American countries. Well, in the United States, they're all seen as Hispanic and put under the Hispanic category. In reality, they're so diverse from each other. When I'm not actually with them and they start talking about politics or whatever, they have like completely divergent views on stuff. They come from different countries, different realities. Quite a diverse group. The research suggests on this ethnic identification dimension of life in the Latino world, that Latino children are also worshiping in multicultural, multilingual contexts. Either way, all this means is that we're living among people who are not afraid to confess their faith in strongly enculturated forms of devotion and worship. And I'll say something on this in a little bit. So I think we're dealing with two different kinds of paradigms or two different stories, and they may or not relate to each other. One story, I think, is the research on the nuns and what Bob Newton calls, the church in Babylon, in post-Christian society. But then another story is this whole global South thing. All right, and I've been trying to see how I can get a handle on that other paradigm. The U.S., this U.S. Global South group does not reflect as a whole, there are exceptions, does not reflect as a whole the attitudes of the nuns. More broadly, it does not reflect a post-Christian, unchurched, agnostic, atheist, secularized society. We're talking about a different kind of population. Now, this other story, the story of recent immigrants, including Global South Christians and of their children, on the rise, that requires a complementary model for church mission in the future. Such model will complement the research on the nuns and my colleague Newton's research on mission in Babylon. When it comes to mission, what does it mean to take seriously the global South? So, inspired a bit by the work of Virgilio Elizondo, who's a Mexican-American Roman Catholic theologian, who now teaches at Notre Dame, but actually serves a parish in San Antonio. It's been around for a while. Inspired on his work, I've begun to speak about not missions in Babylon, but missions in Galilee. Missions in Galilee. So in other words, missions among strangers who don't quite fit Jerusalem, they don't quite fit Babylon or Rome. They're accepted in neither place. They have strange accents. They're religious, but not always seen as pure. You know, stuff that people thought about Galileans in the time of Jesus, right? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? You know what the implication is. No, God cannot possibly be working from those weird places. Peter, how did people know he was a disciple of Jesus? The accent gave him away. He's not one of us. He's not in. There we think of Jesus as having an accent. The Galilean, not quite fitting in. How can the Messiah come from such a place? People like Jesus and his disciples, they never quite accepted either place. Jesus, the Galilean, is not accepted by Jerusalem. It's not accepted by Babylon either. Gets crucified. You see? So Virgilio Elizondo says, this reminds me of Mexican Americans. They're not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, and they're not American enough for the North Americans. They're truly a borderlands people. They fit neither here nor there. They're looked at suspiciously on both sides. And yet, who are going to be the bridge people? Right? Because they can see what's the good, the bad, and the ugly on both sides of the border. And by border, I don't mean only like an actual border, but the cultural borders, right? The linguistic borders. Bridge people who can see what's good, bad on both sides. Bridge people who can bring together. Immigrants, global South Christians, and minorities in the United States are compared to the rest of the U.S. population, compared to the rest, overwhelmingly marginalized. If a post-Christian model deals with the non-believer, or at least the unaffiliated, of the North Atlantic, there must be another model that also deals with the non-person in our communities, whether recent immigrants or ethnic minorities or other vulnerable neighbors. Where do they fit in a missions model? Not surprisingly, global South Christians, minorities, and their children typically like to ask how Christian faith is active in love and in society, how it deals with the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, other vulnerable neighbors in society. That's like in the radar all the time. And it's one of the characteristics of Global South communities. They come from a long tradition of social engagement. When a church becomes primarily middle class, it's a little harder to relate to large sectors of the population that might be in need. Might be a little harder because you're not always close to the reality, you don't always see it face to face. The church in the future will have to show how their institutions will serve and be enriched by these strangers, the ones who fit neither here nor there and yet are kind of both and people. They can be bridge people. How will they enrich those strangers in our midst? How will their faith, handed down, meet concrete needs of people in our churches? Something to think about. So that's Virgilio Elizondo for you. Now, what I want to suggest is that these two mission models, call it what you want, right? Missions in Babylon, missions in a post-Christian society on the one hand, and then missions in Galilee, missions, maybe even Samaria, right? It's kind of the same thing. Just remember the book of Acts, right? The gospel has to go from Jerusalem and then to Samaria. And when it gets to Samaria, it's like, wow, Holy Spirit can't yet descend in any kind of visible way upon the Samaritans until the apostles actually show up. And part of the reason is because Jerusalem would have had a very hard time thinking that Samaritans could have the Holy Spirit and that the gospel was also for them. Where are the Samaritans of our day today? They're religious, you see. They don't have everything together. And yet they also can put their faith in this Jesus guy. What do we do with those people? So anyways, another mission model, that has to take account of this sector of the population, which is growing, this Global South sector. Now, the two stories are kind of complex, right? Because they intersect at times. Let me give you some examples of this. We may ask the question, will the Christian church in the future be doing missions in a post-Christian society, or will it be doing missions in a marginalized religious society? Well, the answer is yes. That's right. That's the point. It's both. And the picture is more complex. The stories intersect. For example, and here perhaps it's good to talk about Latin America just a little bit. We know now that we've known this for about 5 years now, but sometimes research comes out and says this is new information. Well, but we've known for some time now that one out of every four Roman Catholics leave the Catholic Church. Now this is true in Latin America. 1 out of every 4 leave the Catholic Church. Now the same is true for Latinos in the United States. Same demographic. Why? Because the shift did not happen in the United States. See, people think, they come to the United States, it's a more secularized culture, therefore now is when they leave the church. No, actually that happened already in Latin America. So, it's not when you come into a so-called more secularized place that now there's a shift. This happens before, and what that tells you is that there is also secularism in the Global South. You see? So, so this gets a little complex. It might not be overwhelmingly so, but there has been a rise in secularism, especially among the young and people under 30. And this is in Latin America. Now, some countries more than others. That has to be granted. Well, guess what? That matches exactly the research on the nuns in the United States, where about 30% of adults 30 and under, including Latinos, right, tend to be either religiously unaffiliated or tend to go more agnostic. But this is already happening in parts of the Global South. So again, the Global South, right, we have the big demographics, but then you have this sort of intersection where you find rise in secularism in a sector of the population that you would typically think of as religious. Now, of course, we can have a discussion about whether secularism is a religion, all right, but that's something else. But then in the United States, when one thinks everybody's going secularized in some shape or form, all of a sudden you have the Latinos, a big sector, kind of changing that perception. Now, the Pew Research on the nuns says that when it comes to race, the recent change has been concentrated in one group, whites. 1/5 of non-Hispanic whites now describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated, up 5 percentage points from 2007. By contrast, the share of Hispanics who are religiously unaffiliated has not changed by a statistically significant margin in recent years, at least not until recently, because we just got new research that says no. A new research on Latinos' religious identity says no, a growing number of Latinos do not identify with any religion. What does that do for Global South research? Aren't we all supposed to be religious? About 18% of Latinos in the United States are religiously unaffiliated. Why should we do Hispanic ministry? They all go to church anyways. It's a little bit more complex. A little bit more complex. The research notes that unaffiliated Hispanics roughly resemble the unaffiliated segment of the general public. So, yes, when you talk about post-Christian research, it's mostly whites, but then not exclusively, right? And then when you talk about Global South, including Latinos, yeah, they're often Christian, but not always. Two stories, and then the two stories intersect at times. Now, in terms of their religious beliefs and practices, the unaffiliated are a diverse group and are far from being uniformly secular. So it's not true that all the unaffiliated are secularized. Now, just 5% say that they actually attend worship services on a weekly basis. That's true. But 1/3 of the unaffiliated say religion is at least somewhat important in their lives. 2/3 believe in God, though less than half say they are absolutely certain of God's existence. And although a substantial minority of the unaffiliated consider themselves neither religious nor spiritual, the majority describe themselves as either religious or as spiritual, but not religious. So they're kind of all over the place. Now, among Global South people, the world is seen in spiritual terms for the most part. You have to think of magical realism, right? Gabriel Garcia Marquez just passed away not too long ago. But the distinction between secular and spiritual is not so clear as in the West. Belief in the spirit world is clearly prominent. Jenkins talked about that yesterday. But of course, such belief does not guarantee Christ-centeredness, or that people know what the gospel is, or that the gospel is central to people's lives. That's different, right? Consider how Luther worked in Christendom, and yet he found plenty of opposition to the gospel, and the gospel being obscure, and so on and so forth. So spiritual, of course, does not always mean gospel Christ-centered. So you have mostly people who are not attending when you look churches, when you look at the research on the nuns, but they're not all hopelessly secularized. They're secularized at different levels. On the Global South side, with Latinos, they're religious, often church-going, but not always gospel-centered. So like Jeff was saying yesterday, you have to discern the demographics, right? You have like big, huge demographics and numbers, and then you have to discern a little bit more the complexity of missions. If you're getting the sense here that doing missions in the future in the United States will be difficult, that's exactly what I want you to get out of it. See? And so how do you contextualize the demographics and so on and so forth? One more thing I'll say about this is that the research on the nuns shows that they're critical of institutions, suspicious of authority, but at the same time, the research shows that they find that institutions like the church could be helpful. They can bond people together and they can get stuff done for the community. So the nuns, again, are not hopelessly post-Christian on that point, right? Global South people, they tend to be suspicious of institutions because they've often been oppressed by institutions, but they can also welcome institutions. You know why? Because it gives them a voice and a place at the table. right? I have students, Anglo students who, they're not very appreciative sometimes of, say, a class you're teaching, or they have this self-entitlement that comes with them. And, oh, I don't really need this degree, That's speaking like someone who comes from a culture of abundance. My Latino students are completely different, Very highly appreciative of whatever you can bring to the table. And if you can give them a degree in hand, wow, the institution, the voice, what does this do now? See, it's very different. And yet, Latinos have also different ways of navigating through institutions. When you think about the political context, for example, it is true that Global South research points out Latinos tend to be fairly conservative on things like same-sex sex marriage, abortion, and so on and so forth. But now we're finding out the picture is a little bit more complex. When it comes to Protestant evangelical Latinos, that is the case. When it comes to the unaffiliated Latinos, more on the non side, they're actually more on the liberal spectrum. And when it comes to Roman Catholics, they're in the middle. Complex picture of Latinos. See, you all thought we just were Hispanic, all fit under that umbrella. There's a lot of diversity there. Anyway, so again, we have two stories: missions in Babylon, post-Christian society, missions in Galilee, Samaria, right, marginalized religious society, and sometimes the values and interests of both of these groups sort of intersect, right? Whether you're talking about Latin America or United States Latinos. So, engage in the Global South. What do we do to engage the Global South? Well, here are a couple of things to keep in mind. One thing is that Latin Americans see life through pneumatic lens. We mentioned this before. So the spirit, right? Spiritual warfare, healings, and so on and so forth. So how do we deal with that theologically? How is that part of our reading of the Bible? How is that part of our curriculum, our catechesis, right? There's a colleague of mine, Greg Kloss, who says that we need missiological catechisms. Meaning, you have your main catechism, right? But then, depending on the answers people are asking in different people's groups, you have to develop a local catechism. Roman Catholics are fairly good at this. You have the catechism that's been officially approved by the Vatican, and then you have local catechisms, where you have to contextualize Catholic teaching, right? So maybe we need more of that and say, how does the Spirit come into that? Now, Lutherans have been thinking about this a little bit more, because we tend to always talk in terms of, our sinful flesh, the individual sin, and so on and so forth. In the Global South, they talk a lot more about Satan and what the devil is up to. Not that Satan you talked about. Where is the? That's the devil. In fact, I remember being in Venezuela doing my vicarage, and there was somebody there who was always blaming the devil for everything. After a while, one of the ladies will come out and she says, I'm starting to feel sorry for the devil. We blame for everything. No, that's not good. Something is not right. But Lutherans, for instance, do have a way to speak about this, tentatio. One is attacked in the desert. The word of God and prayer become the instruments of one standing firm against the devil. Well, the Global South brings that perspective. How does one bring that into one's teaching, thinking? The other one is seeing worship through Catholic lens. So you have strongly enculturated forms of worship among Latinos in the United States. All right, so how does one appropriate signs from the culture, right, in worship? For example, if you use a crucifix in certain Latin American contexts, that doesn't mean that people will understand that rightly. A crucifix could just be an amulet, something that makes you prosperous if you keep it around the house. Or it will, help protect you from the evil eye or a curse somebody put on you. Is that what a crucifix is for? How does a crucifix work? A crucifix could also lead to the idea that Christ is in solidarity with the marginalized, which is good, but then Christ is always dying, right? Did he ever go to the cross to take away our sins? Did he ever was he ever raised from the dead? Again, how does a cultural sign function? Is it an obstacle to the gospel, or does it allow us to proclaim the gospel. The other thing is we have to see the social political implications of the faith. That's huge among Latinos. They want to know, you're a Christian, what does that mean for immigration? What does that mean for, issues of justice at all levels, all right? And so maybe the missions in Galilee model here could be helpful. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind when engaging the Global South. I also have maybe some things to think about in terms of implications at an institutional level, and then I'll quit. And again, this is maybe for our continued conversation. I'm having a hard time getting this. Okay. But just to give you a sense of what I'm thinking here, I'm really, I think that we can talk about the Global South all we want, but unless we find ways of, and I mean this in the best possible sense, ways of bringing into our institutional life these dimensions of Christian growth, this is not going to happen. It's going to be wishful thinking. So just to give you an example of this, I wonder, how we can bring Global South Christians into the pipelines of synodical institutions. How many Latino children come through the parochial school system, right? What does the CUS system, the Concordia University system, what does it do to bring Latino student body, staff, faculty into its numbers? In other words, what strategies are in place for that to happen, like within the next, well, we're a little behind already, but 5, 10, 15 years. Concordia Seminary is now thinking about bringing and already sort of working on a call to bring, hopefully, a director of intercultural engagement. So who's going to work with communities, with Galilean communities in the United States, to bring them into the life of the church, institutional and otherwise? So we have to ask that question. How does the Global South and children of the Global South begin to come into our institutions in a more strategic way? Otherwise, we could be talking about the mission field, but unless you have people who represent those communities working in your midst, who have access to committee work, and so on and so forth, it's going to be very hard for at least the Lutheran Church to reflect in its constituency the rising Global South in her midst. So I'll leave you with that, and then we can pick up some conversation afterwards. So thank you.